The snow was falling thicker than usual, like the gods were trying to smother something before it rose. Castle Black stood quiet, cold, and hollow. The wind howled like a warning, but Jon Snow didn't flinch. He stood on the wall, staring down into the shadows beyond, but his thoughts were elsewhere, deeper, darker. They called him the hero, the rightful heir, the one who didn't want the crown but deserved it most. That's what made people trust him. That's what made Daenerys lower her guard. That's why the North bent the knee. But Jon, he was never the same after the war. Not after the fire. Not after he came back from the dead. Truth is, something didn't return with him. Or maybe something else came back in its place. They never questioned him. Why would they? He was quiet, humble, the reluctant king. He stood in the shadows while others screamed for power. But Jon had learned silence was more powerful than words. Let them fight. Let them burn cities. Let them reveal their madness. All he had to do was wait. And when the time was right, act. No one ever saw it coming. Not even Daenerys. Especially not her. He loved her once, or at least, he thought he did. But love doesn't survive war. And once he saw what she was capable of, what he was capable of, something inside shifted. He looked at her the morning after King's Landing burned, and for the first time, he didn't see a savior. He saw a rival. And Jon Snow did not share power. The talks of rebuilding, of ruling together, of mercy and change, they were just noise to him now. The realm didn't need a queen. It needed peace. And peace would never come while dragons still flew and Targaryens still dreamed. So he made a choice. A quiet, deadly choice. He held her in his arms, whispered loyalty, swore love, and then drove the dagger through her heart like a promise kept. Her eyes widened not in betrayal, but in disbelief. Like the one man she thought pure had become the monster she feared. She didn't even scream, just silence, and the sound of a body hitting stone. He kissed her forehead before she went cold. To the world, it was mercy, a hard choice, a noble act. The tragic lover forced to kill for the greater good. But Jon knew the truth. He didn't do it for peace. He did it because she stood in his way. And now, as he stood above the wall, breathing in the ice and wind, he wondered what came next. The North hailed him. Tyrion had been silenced. The Unsullied sailed away. Bran sat on a throne Jon never wanted because he let him. It was all too easy, because Jon had already won. He hadn't just killed the queen. He had rewritten the story, painted himself as the man who lost everything. But he still had Ghost, still had the loyalty of the wildlings, still had the sword, and most importantly, he still had the people. And that was more dangerous than any army. Footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. Tormund, you ready to head out? The red-bearded warrior asked, eyes scanning the frost-covered path northward. Jon turned slowly, his face unreadable. Yeah, he said, let's go. But even as they rode into the trees beyond the wall, Jon wasn't done. This wasn't exile, this was regrouping. And in the quiet north, away from watchful eyes, he'd build something new. Something colder, stronger. Because the greatest trick Jon Snow ever pulled was making the world believe he was the hero. When, in truth, he was the end. The wind bit hard in the far north, harsher than Jon remembered. But he didn't complain. Not even once. Tormund trudged beside him, chatting about wildling camps, old giants, and how summer's taking its sweet bloody time. But Jon barely heard him. His mind was fixed ahead, not just on the trail, but on the plan. The one no one knew about. To the others, Jon was in exile. A broken man, the Queenslayer. A warrior too noble to fight for the throne, too dangerous to let roam free. Sending him back to the wall was the easiest solution. Safe, clean, they thought they'd gotten rid of him. They were wrong. He hadn't come to the north to die. He came to build. Beyond the wall, the old powers had scattered. The White Walkers were gone. The Night King shattered into ice dust. The living had won, or so they believed. But John knew. Better. The dark wasn't gone. It was just sleeping. And the free folk? They were ready to follow anyone who spoke their language. Pain, survival, truth. John didn't smile much, but inside, he was already shaping something colder than Winterfell ever knew. When they reached the first wildling camp, a dozen grizzled faces turned to stare, eyes hard, bows slightly raised. They didn't forget easily, but they respected strength. And Jon Snow, he'd died and come back. He'd killed a queen. He'd stood against the dead. That kind of man was worth listening to. Jon Snow, a tall woman with scars across her face, growled, "Why are you here?" He met her eyes. "To live," she snorted. "You call this living?" Jon stepped forward, rushing past Tormund. "The South is dead, rotted. They pretend they've made peace, but they're just waiting to bleed again. You know it. I know it. But up here, we still have a chance." Zingna. Camp murmured, uneasy. "I'm not your king," Jon said quietly. "I'm not your lord. But I've seen what's coming. I've felt it. The world isn't done breaking. It's only just begun. Then what do you want?" The scarred woman asked. Jon's answer was soft, almost a whisper. "To prepare." And just like that, the first seed was planted. That night, he sat near the fire, sharpening Longclaw while Tormund snored on a log behind him. The wildlings were watching him, some curious, some cautious, but no one sent him away. Because deep down, they felt it too. The cold wasn't just weather. It was a warning. As flames danced on his blade, Jon thought of Daenerys, her final breath, the warmth of her blood soaking into his hands. He didn't regret it. Not anymore. She wanted to break the wheel, but Jon? He wanted to burn it down, quietly, piece by piece. He was tired of watching empires fall, just to let another tyrant rise. Bran was no better. He sat on that chair of swords with no eyes and no soul, a puppet to those who wanted quiet control. But out here, in the unforgiving north, there were no thrones, no laws, just survival. Jon would take that raw chaos and shape it into something unstoppable. By the time spring thawed the bones of winter, he'd have the trust of every clan beyond. The wall. He'd whisper truth in their ears, remind them of the South's betrayals, of the queens and kings who'd let them die, of the way the world forgot the wild. And they would remember. He would make sure of it. He stood from the fire and looked into the trees, the black between. Branches. It felt familiar, not frightening. Like something waiting to rise again. The old magic wasn't dead. It was just hiding. Jon Snow didn't come north to vanish. He came to start over. Not as a brother of the Watch, not as a Stark, and not as the heir of anything. He was something else now. A shadow in the snow, a storm beneath silence. And the world would feel it soon. Weeks passed. The frost gave way to thin mud and hungry trees. The air warmed, but not enough to make people forget the cold they'd crawled through. Jon moved with the wildlings from one ruined outpost to another, gathering remnants of shattered. Cleansed those broken by the war with the dead, those hiding from the South, those who no longer believed in anything but the bite of winter. But they came to him quietly, slowly, one by one. At first, they brought questions and weapons. Then, loyalty. He didn't ask them to kneel. He didn't need banners. No songs, no titles. Just a look in the eye, a hand around a sword, and the promise that the South would one day choke on the same silence they gave to the North. John knew the difference between worship and obedience. He wanted neither. He wanted belief. He gave the wildlings something more dangerous than hope a purpose. And soon they started calling him the Ghost King. Not to his face, not yet, but around the fires, whispered through cracked lips. He didn't stop them. He let the name grow like moss over stone. Tormund watched it unfold with a strange mixture of pride and unease. One night, as they skinned a massive elk near the edge of the haunted forest, Tormund finally said it. "You're building something, Snow." John didn't answer. "Not just shelters, or a safe place for the free folk. You're planning more." John wiped blood from his knife, slow and quiet. "You ever think we lost a war? We didn't. We beat the dead." "Did we?" John looked up, and his eyes were hollow. They just wanted silence. No pain, no hunger. What did we bring back in their place? Politics? Lies? Another Iron Throne? Tormund frowned. "That's not our problem anymore." "It will be," John said. "The South doesn't leave us alone. It never has. It comes back with banners and taxes and knives hidden in treaties. We bled for them, died for them, and they sent me away. Like I was a curse. You stabbed their queen." John's jaw clenched. "I saved the world from her. And who saves it from you?" There was a pause between them. Just the wind and the soft crackle of fire. John didn't flinch. He stared into Tormund's eyes, cold and steady. No one. And for a moment, even Tormund didn't know whether to feel pity or fear. By the next moon, more camps had joined. Old enemies united under a new name. Not Jon Snow, not the bastard of Winterfell, but the North returned. They began to train. Not like soldiers. Jon didn't want armies. He wanted survivors. Warriors who knew how to vanish in trees, strike like shadows, and speak only when silence had served its purpose. The South would never see them coming. They would be ghosts in furs and fury, a storm that came from nothing. One night, while sharpening Lone Claw beside a frozen stream, John heard something strange. Wings, not the soft flutter of birds. Something heavier, older. He looked up. A flash of white, high in the sky. Then it vanished. The others hadn't seen it. They were busy singing, drinking, sharpening axes. But John stood alone by the water, eyes scanning the dark. A dragon? No. Impossible. He'd watched the last one fall into the snow, shrieking Dany's name. But still, his blood prickled. He reached into his coat and pulled out a blackened pendant, something he had taken from Daenerys after her death. A piece of dragon glass wrapped in a thread of her silver hair. A keepsake? Maybe, or maybe something more. The old magic wasn't dead. It was waiting for him to believe again. John didn't blink as he slid the pendant back into his cloak. If the old gods wanted to test him, let them come. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a savior. He was something they hadn't seen before. A wolf with the soul of ice. A man no longer bound by honor or family or duty. He would return to the South one day, but not to beg forgiveness. He'd return as the consequence of every lie they ever told. Spring never really touched the North the way it did the South. Even when the sun stayed longer in the sky and the rivers cracked open from their icy shells, the air still carried the weight of silence. Like the land itself remembered every death it had buried. Jon Snow moved through it like a ghost. No longer. Just a man more like a symbol now. Something colder, sharper. The wildlings followed, but they didn't shear. They watched. And waited. In the third moon of the thaw, a scout returned to their hidden camp near the ruined fortress of Craster's Keep. He was panting, face streaked with sweat and fear. "Horsemen," he gasped, "wearing the crown's colors. 10, maybe more. They're heading north fast." John didn't speak. He just turned to Longclaw, wrapped in old cloth by his bedroll, and began tying it to his hip. Tormund grunted. "Let me go talk to them. Maybe it's just a check-in. A patrol." "They don't patrol up here," John said. "Not since they threw me out." "You don't think they came for?" "They came for me." The soldiers arrived 2 days later. Southern Knights. Not Lannister gold, not Stark gray, but a new banner, the broken wheel, Bran's chosen sigil, meant to represent peace, equality. John looked at it and saw weakness. Their leader was a young knight, maybe 23, eyes too soft for the job. He wore polished armor that glinted. In the weak northern sun, clearly meant more for ceremony than survival. He addressed John with stiff formality. "Jon Snow, by the decree of King Bran the Broken, you are requested to return south and stand before the council. You are to answer for your gathering of armed forces beyond the wall." John stared at him like he was already a corpse. "Council?" He said, "Yes, my lord. The realm has noticed movements. Rumors. You have stirred fear, and the king, he believes a peaceful conversation may resolve this." John stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "Bran sent you here, with 10 men, to have a conversation. In the wild?" The knight blinked. "We didn't come to fight. We came to bring me back in chains." The knight hesitated. "Only if necessary." That's when John gave the signal. Not with words, just a slight glance to the trees behind them. The first arrow struck a soldier in the throat. He gurgled and fell sideways off his horse. Then chaos. The wildlings moved like ghosts, silent, brutal, precise. No war cries, no banners, just blood in the snow. When it was over, 8 of the 10 lay dead. 1 had fled into the woods. 1, the knight, remained wounded and kneeling, staring at John like he couldn't understand what had just happened. "You were supposed to be better than this," the knight spat. John crouched beside him. "I was," he said, "and it nearly got me killed." He stood and turned to the others. "Burn the bodies. Keep the armor. Strip the banner." "You're not sending a message back?" Tormund asked. John looked out into the trees. "I just did." That night, there was no celebration. The wildlings didn't cheer like they'd won a battle. Because they hadn't. They had crossed a line. And now there was no turning back. John sat alone, watching the flames eat through southern flesh and royal cloth. The crown would know soon. Bran would know. They'd realize their exiled prince hadn't disappeared. He had declared war. And this time, there would be no honor in it, no noble speeches, no whispers of rightful claim, just snow, steel, and silence. The next morning, John began moving camp. He no longer wore black. He dressed in white furs, now ghost-like, clean, cold. His hair was longer, the scars on his face deeper. His eyes, once kind, now held nothing but clarity. He had tried peace. He had knelt. He had killed the woman he once loved because they asked him to. But now he would never kneel again. And when he returned to the south, when he walked through King's Landing's gates, he would not do so with treaties. He would bring winter back to the realm, the true winter, the one they deserved. The word traveled faster than ravens. By the time the trees turned green again, the South already knew. 10 riders sent. None returned. Bran the Broken, the king who had seen through time, had made the mistake of thinking Jon Snow was still the man they buried once before, still the bastard who bore other people's burdens. But the realm had forgotten one thing. You can't exile a ghost. You only teach it to haunt. In King's Landing, the small council murmured behind locked doors, behind golden walls and polished tables. Tyrion spoke of caution. Davos argued for diplomacy. Sansa's letter from Winterfell was short, but her warning was cold. He is not the brother I remember. Do not send another fool to the north. But Bran sat still, his milky eyes distant, his face unreadable. We let him go, Tyrion said, voice tight. We agreed to exile, not execution. If he's raising arms, he is doing what we never allowed him to do, Sansa's words echoed. Become himself. Back beyond the wall, Jon had built something more than an army. He'd created a belief. In the free folk and outcasts. In the broken men cast away by southern nobility. Former soldiers. Exiled lords. Men who once fought for coin, but now followed him like zealots. They called themselves the Silent Rain, and they didn't speak much. They acted. Jon didn't need gold. He didn't need ravens. He had whispers, firelight, and hunger. What made his army dangerous wasn't numbers. It was purpose. Each man and woman who followed him had lost something to the south. A brother to Lannister steel. A daughter to Targaryen fire. A homeland to indifference. Jon didn't promise justice. He promised reckoning, and they loved him for it. In one cold valley south of the shivering sea, Jon stood before a half-circle of his captains. Scarred wildlings, broken Night's Watch deserters, a mute girl who once served under Cersei and now carried knives in both boots. We'll move south before the snow returns, Jon said, rolling a map across a rock. We take the Dreadfort first, then Last Hearth. Not because we need the land, but because we need the message sent. Tormund grunted, arms folded. You really mean to march on Winterfell? Jon didn't look up. If Sansa stands in our way, yes. The room fell silent. She's your sister, Tormund said. She's a ruler now, Jon replied, and rulers choose sides. There was no bitterness in his voice. No heat, just truth. He remembered what Sansa said when they last saw each other, after Dany's death, after the council passed their judgment. She hugged him, soft and cold, and whispered, You did what you had to, but they'll never let you rest. She was right. Now neither of them would. The Dreadfort fell without blood. The lords who ruled it under the Stark banner had grown lazy, too used to peace. When Jon's forces moved through the woods and struck silently at night, they surrendered before dawn. No fires, no screams, just fear. Jon made them kneel, not to him, not even to the old gods, to the cause. That was his genius. He never claimed. He was a king, never took a crown. He made others decide what he was. And in that void, they built him up higher than any throne ever could. He spent the nights sharpening his blade, listening to the wind through the pine trees, thinking of her Daenerys. Not with grief, not with love, but with quiet understanding. She had become fire to fight fire. He had become snow to smother. The flame. And now the flame was rising again, in Bran's polished halls, in Sansa's careful letters, in every southern lord who saw the north as nothing more than cold land and colder people. Jon would remind them, the north wasn't just snow. It was blood beneath it. That night, a raven arrived. From Sansa, a simple message. Do not cross the Wolfswood. I won't protect you again. Jon burned the letter without reading it. Twice, protection was never what he wanted. He would cross the Wolfswood. And if Winterfell stood in his way, he would burn it clean. The Wolfswood had always been silent, but this silence was different. He could feel it, the land watching him. The trees didn't whisper. They listened. The wind didn't bite. It held its breath. Jon Snow moved through the woods like a shadow, his silent reign at his back, men and women in cloaks of gray and quoth, White blades oiled to silence, eyes colder than the rivers they crossed. They were no army in shining armor. They were wolves, outcasts, weapons forged in exile, and they were heading home. Winterfell stood a day's march ahead, its towers still proud, its banners still bearing the direwolf sigil. But Jon hadn't worn that sigil in months. The wolf that once howled for honor now moved without a name. At dusk, they stopped on a ridge overlooking the fields where Jon once trained with Robb, once bled with Theon, once said goodbye to a father who never was. Ghost padded silently beside him, fur graying, red eyes glowing faint in the half-light. "You remember this place?" Jon murmured. Ghost stared forward, unmoving. So did Jon. He didn't speak to the others that night, not even Tormund. He sat by the fire, sharpening Longclaw, its blade whispering against stone. It no longer felt like a sword. It felt like a key one that would unlock something far darker than a gate. In Winterfell, Sansa prepared too. She had seen the ravens. The rumors, the whispers that Jon Snow had become more than a man. He had become a myth. Her people still spoke his name with reverence, but with fear now too. She stood at the ramparts, hair braided tight, cloak whipping in the wind. She'd fortified the walls, called on loyal bannermen, closed the gates, but in her heart she knew none of that would matter. This wasn't war. This was judgment. "I begged you to stay in the shadows," she whispered into the cold air, as if Jon might hear it somehow. "I begged you not to become him." The him she feared wasn't the brother who gave her his cloak after Ramsay, not the man who held her hand before battle. It was the man who returned from the dead with eyes too quiet, a heart too still. Jon had become something that no longer bent for the living. The next morning he came. No horns, no battle cry. Just a single figure walking across the snow-swept field with Ghost beside him, and the silent rain behind like mist. The drawbridge stayed raised, the walls full of archers, but none fired. Because it was him. And they didn't know whether to aim or to kneel. Sansa met him at the gate alone, armored, calm. She looked down at her brother, her blood, and tried to find a trace of the boy who once smiled by the fire. He was gone. He looked up at her, calm and unreadable. "You sent me a warning." "I meant it. I know." He paused. "That's why I came." "What do you want, Jon?" "I want what they always feared I would," he said. "What they sent me away to avoid." Sansa's voice tightened. "A crown?" "No," he said. "A reckoning." And in that moment, she realized something colder than any blizzard. He wasn't here to conquer Winterfell. He was here to test who he had to destroy to move forward. "You'll have to go through me." Jon nodded once. "Then I will." There was no rage in his voice, no hatred, just finality. That night, the walls held. But inside, the people whispered. Half remembered Jon Snow as their true lord. Half feared what he had become. And Sansa felt the line split beneath her feet. She didn't sleep. She sat in a great hall with a blade across her lap, candlelight flickering on the stone table where once they carved bread and laughed as children. She thought of Arya, of Bran, of Ned, and of what it would mean to lose Winterfell to her own kin. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the woods, Jon Snow waited. Not as a brother, not as a son of Stark, but as the storm they had exiled and now couldn't keep out. The first snow of early winter fell that night. Light, silent, almost kind like the land itself was trying to blanket the north, in innocence before blood touched the ground again. But innocence was long dead. At dawn, Jon stood just beyond the range of Winterfell's archers, Ghost flanking him like a sentinel carved from snow. Behind them, The silent rain assembled not in formation, not like a southern army, but in silent clusters, weapons sheathed, faces veiled. No banners, no drums, just tension coiled tight as drawn bowstrings. John didn't move. He waited. Inside Winterfell, Sansa paced the battlements. Her armor was simple black wool and steel. Her hands were steady, but her jaw ached from clenching. "He won't attack," Mr. Coleraine muttered beside her. "He's testing your nerves." "He doesn't have to," she replied. "I've known him my whole life. He's not bluffing." The gate didn't open. John hadn't asked it to. He was beyond negotiation now. A rider approached from the western hills, fast, covered in dust. A scout. Sansa turned as the rider leapt from his horse, barely bowing. Lady Stark-Torrhen's square has fallen. They didn't even resist. John entered, spoke with the men, and they swore fealty. Her heart sank. Another piece lost, without a sword raised. John was taking the north not by force, but by belief. He was becoming inevitable. Sansa dismissed the scout and turned to the walls. Her people archers, guards, gatekeepers, they weren't ready to fire. Not really. Too many remembered John as he was. And that was the problem. She couldn't hold a city whose heart still beat for a ghost. That night she held council. Her bannermen argued, some begged her to parley, others urged her to strike. She listened, nodded, and said little. When the room emptied, she sat alone, at the high table where her father once presided, and she wrote a letter. Just 3 lines. "I don't know what you've become, but if there's still a piece of the brother I loved, do not make me do this." She sealed it and had it delivered under the cover of dark. By morning, no raven returned. Instead, Jon Snow himself stood at the gates. The guards hesitated, confused. Had come alone, no army behind him, no weapon drawn. Just Lone Claw on his back, and the weight of the storm in his eyes. Sansa met him in the courtyard, surrounded by guards. Every step she took as heavy as stone. The walls watched. The servants watched. The north held its breath. Jon's face was unreadable. He handed her back the letter, unopened, unread. She swallowed. "You were always the quiet one," she said. Jon tilted his head. "And you were always watching, planning. You've made your choice then?" He nodded and said nothing. Sansa stepped closer, slow, her voice lowering so only he could hear. "You'll have to kill me." "I don't want to," he said. "That never stopped you before." For a moment, something flickered in Jon's eyes. Regret, maybe. I? Shadow of the boy he once was. But then it was gone. "I offered peace," he said. "You chose to stand in the way." "This is Winterfell," she hissed. "It's not yours to take." He looked around the courtyard, at the soldiers who were hesitating to draw, at the servants who didn't flinch when they saw his face. It already has. Then he turned and walked away. No fight, no blood. But by evening, half of Winterfell's soldiers had deserted. Some slipped out through the Godswood Gate. Others simply laid down their arms. Not out of fear but confusion. Loyalty didn't mean what it used to. The North had seen too many kings, too many wars. But they remembered Jon Snow. They remembered the man who bled for them, died for them. And when he returned, they couldn't help but follow, even if what returned wasn't quite the same. By midnight, the gates opened, not by force, not by siege, by surrender. Sansa watched from her chambers, hands shaking as she drank her wine. She hadn't fought him with steel, and still she'd lost. He hadn't broken down Winterfell. He'd inherited it, and now the real war would begin, because the South would never allow a ghost to rule the North, and Jon Snow would never kneel again. Winterfell stood still again, but it was no longer The home of the Volfit was the haunt of a shadow. Jon Snow walked its halls like a man returned to a memory, yet no warmth clung to his footsteps. The stones beneath him were colder, quieter. The ghosts here were real, and some still breathed. The north bent slowly, and not all at once. The great houses sent ravens careful letters of allegiance wrapped in silk and silence. Some swore, out of loyalty, others out of fear. A few vanished into the snow and never wrote again. Jon didn't chase them. He didn't need to. He had something more powerful than loyalty momentum. Sansa hadn't spoken since the gates fell. She still moved like a queen, head high, eyes sharp, but something inside her had hollowed out. She refused exile. She refused to leave. She simply stayed, watching, waiting, and in that silence, Jon knew. She would never forgive him, but she wouldn't stop him either. Tormund approached him the second night after Winterfell fell. The old warrior no longer smiled when he looked at Jon. "So this is it?" he asked. "This is what you came for?" "No," Jon said, staring out across the battlements. "This is just where it begins. The South won't let it stand. I'm counting on it." And soon enough, the South answered. A raven arrived bearing a simple message from kings. Landing. Return to exile or be named traitor to the realm. This is your final choice. Bran. Jon read it twice, then burned it without a word. Bran had underestimated him again, still thinking in terms of rules, oaths, councils. Jon was done with all of that. He no longer played their game. He was making his own. A week later, his scouts spotted movement near Moat Cailin. Southern forces, spear companies, bannerless, but disciplined, likely from the Reach or the Stormlands. A quiet invasion meant to seize the neck and choke the north before it could rise. Jon didn't hesitate. He left Winterfell before dawn. No horns, no orders. Just his blade and 24 silent Rain riders. They struck like wolves in a fog. No siege, no parley. Just death. By midday, the southern force was gone broken in the marshes, their banners rotting in blood-soaked water. Jon returned before nightfall, armor darkened with muck and memory. He never spoke of it, but the message was clear. This wasn't exile anymore. This was war. And this time, there would be no noble battlefields, no drawn-out sieges. Jon fought the way winter moved. Sudden, ruthless, unstoppable. By the second month, 3 southern lords had fallen. By the third, a river port burned in the night, no banners raised, no claim made, but all knew who had done it. And still Bran said nothing. He remained silent on his throne, eyes vacant, mouth quiet. Some called it wisdom. Others called it fear. Tyrion tried to hold the realm together, but it was already splintering. Whispers reached the streets of King's Landing. Jon Snow is marching south. The wolf has taken the cold with him. He killed a queen. He can kill a king. By now, his legend outpaced the man. And Jon knew it. He didn't chase the myth. He simply walked in its shadow and let the world twist around him. He no longer tried to explain himself. He no longer apologized. The final raven came from Arya. She hadn't written in years. But now her words were sharp and stained in something colder than ink. "I hear you've taken Winterfell. I hear you'll wear white now. I'll see you soon. And if there's nothing left of my brother, I'll put a knife in the thing wearing." His face. Jon didn't burn this letter. He folded it, carried it in his coat, a reminder that somewhere someone still saw him clearly. But even Arya's blade would be too late. Because Jon Snow, the exile, the ghost, the bastard, the betrayer, he was no longer walking toward power. He was the power. And when the South finally opened its gates to face him, when King's Landing's walls darkened with smoke and fear, when the nobles stood trembling before the man they tried to erase, they would see the truth. Not a king, not a savior, but the reckoning they had buried once before. And this time, the North would not forgive, and he would not forget. The Queen's blood still stained his blade, and soon the realm would join her.